They found him half dead in the river bend, arrow in his back, leg slashed open, blood soaking through deerskin, the symbol of his band faintly painted on his chest. And every man in the posse had the same order: shoot if he breathes again. Because Comanche raids had taken 2 settlers last week and burned a barn the night before. But when they cornered him and raised rifles, lightning struck a tree not 20 feet away. The horses reared, and in the chaos he vanished into the canyon, bleeding, dragging himself across stone and sand like a dying wolf, until he collapsed behind a ridge, breathing smoke and pain. And when Eliza found him the next morning, barefoot in her chemise, checking her trap lines just before dawn, her heart nearly burst from fear, because she knew what he was and what helping him meant. But something about his eyes, full of exhaustion, not hatred, froze her, and she dropped to her knees, pressed cloth to his wound and whispered, "Don't move," even though every fiber of her being screamed to run, because this was Comanche land and she was alone, a widow with no rifle and no neighbors for 10 miles since the sickness took her husband and her father the same week. And yet she dragged his heavy body, inch by inch, into her root cellar, covered the door with sacks of potatoes, and waited until the thunder of hooves passed her cabin, rifles gleaming, voices shouting, "He won't get far." And they didn't look inside, not once, not at the quiet girl with dirt on her cheeks and a trembling kettle on the stove. And when the posse left, she lit a lantern, unbarred the cellar, and whispered, "I don't know why I did this," but he didn't answer, just lay there gasping, eyes fluttering, until she boiled water and stitched his wound with shaking hands, one thread at a time, remembering the sound of her mother's voice saying, "Do good even when it hurts." And by nightfall, the fever had set in, and she sat beside him, wiping sweat from his brow, whispering old prayers in broken Latin, not knowing if he understood or even heard. And when she dozed off, head resting on the table, she awoke to silence and his eyes watching her from the floor, full of pain, yes, but also something else, not rage, not fear, curiosity maybe, or disbelief. And when she offered him a cup of broth, he took it without a word, his fingers brushing hers, and for a moment she saw the boy behind the warrior, and he saw the girl behind the settler's blouse, and neither of them moved because outside, the world was full of gunpowder and vengeance, and inside, there was just one wounded man and one lonely woman, locked in the strange silence of survival. And by the 3rd day he could sit up, his hair tangled, his body covered in scars she didn't ask about, and he watched her with the caution of a hunted animal, never reaching for her tools or food until she offered them, never speaking, never touching her. And that night, she found a folded scrap of hide in his pouch, a symbol burned into it, his family's mark, maybe, and she handed it back without asking. And he nodded, and something shifted in the air, like trust trying to take root in scorched soil. And when the posse returned a week later, drunk, frustrated, with fresh accusations, she stood on the porch with her husband's shotgun, hands steady, eyes fierce, and said, "No one came by here." And they laughed, but didn't search the cellar, not with her fire that strong. And when they left, the Comanche man, Solon, he whispered finally when she asked his name, said hers too, Eliza, like it meant something holy. And that night he lit the fire for her. And when her hand shook pouring tea, he steadied it. And when he finally stood in full and looked in the mirror she hadn't touched since her husband died, she saw the warrior become a man again. And he saw the girl become something braver than a soldier. And outside the coyotes howled, and for the first time they didn't flinch. And when he stepped into the sunlight the next day, limping, yes, but standing tall, he didn't head for the woods. He built a fence, then repaired her roof. And when she said, "You should go," he said, "I will," but stayed anyway. And every day they said little but shared more, and she taught him how to bake bread. And he showed her how to track deer without snapping twigs. And at night they sat by the fire, her stitching a shirt, him carving a flute, and though they barely spoke, something louder than words passed between them, something older than war and older than grief. And on the 12th day, when a new posse came, meaner than the last, with torches and names, he stepped outside and stood in front of her door, unarmed, chest bare, scarred but proud, and said, "She saved me." And when one man lifted a rifle, Eliza shouted, "And I'd do it again." And the moment froze like a painting of defiance, and one of the older men lowered his torch, stared at her, then at Solon, and said, "We're not hanging good women," and they left, slow and angry but without a shot fired. And when they were gone, Solon looked at Eliza like she was thunder and rain and sunlight at once, and she looked at him like he was the end of a long, brutal winter. And that night when she opened her door, he stepped inside, not as a fugitive, not as a threat, but as something she didn't have words for yet. And when she whispered, "You can sleep in the house now," he said, "I know." And months passed, and they rebuilt the barn, and she let him teach her Comanche words, and he let her cut his hair when it got too long. And one morning, when a letter came from her sister back east, offering to send money to start over, Eliza burned it without a second thought, because starting over had already happened, not with coin or new dresses, but with a single moment under the dawn sky when two broken people didn't run from each other. And when spring came, they planted corn. And when the river flooded, he lifted her to the roof, laughing. And when the sheriff finally came with a warrant, Solon stepped forward, handed him the same hide token Eliza had once returned, and said, "Tell your judge I owe her my life." And the sheriff, old and tired, nodded and said, "I think that's worth more than rope." And no one came again after that. And in the quiet after storms, when coyotes howled and wind rattled the windows, Eliza would lie awake, hand in Solon's, and think not of what she'd lost, her husband, her innocence, her past, but what she'd found, a man who once was her enemy, a love she never expected, and a future no one believed in but them. And when their child was born the next winter, a girl with his eyes in her fire, they named her Hope, because that was all they'd had once, and it had been enough to change everything.